Hei, hei. Da vil jeg bare i episode nummer 2 av historien til Nytått spille av filmen med en dame som har studert Helena Blavatsky, og den damen heter Julie Chayes. Jeg kommer til å spille av filmen hennes nå, for hun har en fantastisk gjennomgang av Helena Blavatsky og hennes forhold til kabbalah. Og kabbalah har jeg vært inne på mange ganger før. Det er også noe som forkynnere innen trosbevegelsen praktiserer. Så nå skal du få høre hun selv. Så lar jeg bare videoen spille.
Here's a picture of Madame Blavatsky as a young woman, and the more familiar face of Madame Blavatsky, the grandmother of the New Age movements, the infamous grandmother of the New Age movement. The chief theorist of the Theosophical Society, an esoteric movement established in 1875 in New York and developed in Europe, America and India. Blavatsky was an unconventional expatriate Russian from the minor nobility, a voracious reader, a prolific writer on esoteric themes, and a very unusual character. Her major works are Isis Unveiled of 1877, of 2 volumes of around 600 pages each, and her masterwork, The Secret Doctrine, of 1888, again 2 volumes of about 600 pages, and 14 volumes of collected writings, including articles for newspapers and magazines, short stories, and personal correspondence. Although they find their fullest expression in 1888 with the publication of The Secret Doctrine, a lot of Blavatsky's ideas about Kabbalah are actually articulated already in Isis Unveiled more than a decade earlier, and this is important when we come to contextualize Blavatsky's ideas. In addition to Kabbalah, Theosophy syncretized a range of sources including Neo-Hindu and Buddhist thought, spiritualism, contemporary scientific theories, and modern occultism. Theosophists were drawn largely from the professional and upper classes, especially intellectuals and creative thinkers, religious liberals, scientists with an interest in spirituality, feminists, and anybody with a penchant for the unconventional and the unusual. Lots of people ask me if the Theosophical Society still exists. Well, yes, it does, although it's much smaller and less influential today. Its historical significance lies in the fact that it spawned various offshoot movements that have been highly influential in the development of the New Age movement and present-day alternative spiritualities. Its study also provides insights into some of the intellectual and cultural changes that were occurring at the end of the 19th century in Europe, America and India. Recently, there's been some academic work on the various forms of occultist Kabbalah, including the Kabbalistic teachings of the 19th century Freemasons, and Blavatsky has written on the use of Theosophical Kabbalah by Naftali Herz Imber and the Jewish Theosophist A.D. Ezekiel. But as far as I know, the only person to deal specifically with Blavatsky and Kabbalah is Marco Passi, and Passi highlighted Theosophy's role in the creation and juxtaposition of the categories of East and West, with the Kabbalah placed ambiguously between the two. He thus highlighted the participation of Kabbalah in the definition of Eastern and Western esotericism by Blavatsky, which subsequently influenced the development of the present-day academic notion of Western esotericism. Brendan French's work on Blavatsky in the Russian Orthodox Church is also relevant because it touches on a branch of Blavatsky's chain of transmission, of which Kabbalah forms an integral part. And I'll say a little bit more about Passi and French in what follows. In the limited time frame of this presentation, I intend to approach the complexity of Blavatsky's relationship with Kabbalah through a close reading of one extract from The Secret Doctrine. Because this will be an ideational and a historical analysis rather than a literary one, I'm going to deal with different parts of the extract in a slightly different order to that in which Blavatsky wrote them, since it will make more sense that way. And I'm going to highlight the different sections as I go. I'm going to offer some historical contextualization from Blavatsky's Kabbalah and show that it was part of her definition of and solution for the Victorian crisis. As we know, the late 19th century was a time of colonial expansion, of increasing global trade in goods and ideas, and the ascent of science. As well as being a world preoccupied with evolution, there was also significant cultural pessimism. Historians initially conceived of the Victorian crisis of faith as a widespread loss of religious belief after 1859, but now understand it in a more nuanced way as including various types of crises. In Blavatsky's definition of the crisis, monotheism and materialism were blamed for the intellectual and spiritual problems of the period. She equated the Kabbalistic doctrine of Ein Sof with the Neo-Vedantic concept of Parabrahman and offered the ensuing emanationist cosmogony as part of an anti-monotheist and anti-materialist polemic. I'm going to discuss these polemics in some of their wider contexts, namely contemporary theories about the evolution of monotheism, the 19th century Hindu Renaissance, and the rise of scientific naturalism. I argue that the overall theme in all of this is the use of Kabbalah by Blavatsky for anti-authoritarian ends. Blavatsky used Kabbalah generally and the notion of Ein Sof in particular to rail against the authority of scientists, academics, and clergy while setting herself up as a privileged new authority. This suggests that, at least for Blavatsky, the Victorian crisis was as much a crisis of authority as of anything else. Hang on a minute. Okay. Here's a passage from Secret Doctrine. Unless the Kabbalah, or what is left of it, is read by the light of the Eastern esoteric philosophy, its study leads only to the discovery that, on the lines traced by exoteric Judaism and Christianity, the monotheism of both is nothing more exalted than ancient astrolatry, now vindicated by modern astronomy. The Kabbalists never cease to repeat that primal intelligence can never be understood, hence the Ein Sof, the unknowable, the unnameable, which, as it could not be made manifest, was conceived to emanate manifesting powers. It is then with its emanations alone that human intellect has to and can deal. Christian theology, having rejected the doctrine of emanations and replaced them with direct conscious creations of angels and the rest out of nothing, now finds itself hopelessly stranded between supernaturalism, or miracle, and materialism. An extra-cosmic God is fatal to philosophy. An intracosmic deity, i.e. spirit and matter inseparable from each other, is a philosophical necessity. Separate them, and that which is left is a gross superstition under a mask of emotionalism. This is a very rich passage, and I'd like to start by elaborating a little on Blavatsky's beliefs about why the Kabbalah, in its present form, is incomplete. This involves looking at some aspects of Blavatsky's version of the chain of transmission of the secret doctrine, that is, her version of the Prisca Theologia of the Renaissance Christian Kabbalists. Blavatsky's emphasis on the misuse of power in the transmission of Kabbalah, especially by the Church Fathers and the Catholic clergy, is consistent with the challenges to ecclesiastical authority that were gaining momentum towards the end of the 19th century. For Blavatsky, the term Kabbalah designated a branch of the secret doctrine, the pristine and perennial wisdom tradition that had been transmitted by the Atlanteans to the Aryans. Subsequently, the Kabbalah had been transmitted by various groups at different points in history, but had become corrupted along the way. Groups or persons that were believed to have received a version of the secret doctrine in its Kabbalistic form included Moses, the Chaldeans, the Jews in general, but Shimon Bar Yochai in particular, the Essenes, Jesus, St. John, and the Gnostics. This Kabbalistic wisdom was connected both with Egypt and with ancient India. Blavatsky spoke of two branches of the Kabbalah, the Eastern Aryan branch, which was the closest to the original secret doctrine, and the Chaldeo-Jewish branch, which was relatively more corrupted. The Chaldeo-Jewish branch began with Moses, who was said to have been an Egyptian priest. The Kabbalah was initially corrupted because of his personal ambition, when the tribal and phallic deity Jehovah was incorrectly elevated as the one true God. This this is what Blavatsky meant when she said that monotheism was no better than the worship of the heavenly bodies. And interestingly, this notion of a phallic Jehovah was not new to Blavatsky. It was in the style of the late 19th century erotic writer Edward Sellon, as shown by Jocelyn Godwin in his Theosophical Enlightenment. Returning to Blavatsky's chain of transmission, subsequent to Moses, both Christians and Jews had been guilty of further monotheistic distortions, despite having received the Kabbalistic wisdom through various channels. The Jews were supposed to have received the esoteric knowledge from both Egypt and ancient India and Chaldean wisdom during the Babylonian captivity. Blavatsky equated the Pharisees with the Egyptian therapeuti and said that the Essenes, also of Egyptian origin, were the teachers of Jesus. Jesus was a Kabbalist, by the way, who had passed the earlier years of his life in Egypt. She argued that the true form of early Christianity was Gnosticism, which was also associated with the Essenes. The New Testament was supposed to contain ancient Egyptian elements, and Blavatsky highlighted St. John's Gospel as particularly Gnostic, arguing that it was written in the mystery language of the Tanaim, the relic of Chaldeo-Egyptian wisdom, in other words, the Kabbalah. Blavatsky's somewhat contradictory statements on the value of the Zohar indicate that she believed that although it was by no means perfect, of all the Jewish works of Kabbalah, it was the least corrupt. Although the Church Fathers were condemned as monotheistic distorters, Blavatsky argued that Origen knew some Kabbalistic wisdom. For the sake of power, the Catholic Church had deliberately obfuscated Kabbalistic knowledge, although some esoteric teachings remain hidden in the Vatican. Marco Pasi noted the irony of Blavatsky's turning of the Christian Kabbalist project on its head, that is, that she used Kabbalah to disprove Christianity rather than to prove it. But Brendan French correctly pointed out that scholars have consistently erred in assessing Blavatsky's response to Christianity because they overlooked the nuanced demarcation she regularly made between Christianity and churchianity, and there are a few examples of Blavatsky coming out quite strongly in favour of the Russian Orthodox Church, saying that in Russia the pure ideal of Christ was still preserved. Interestingly, she described England and America as pseudo-Christian countries. So that's some surprising words there from Blavatsky. And her self-understanding then was that she was upholding true Kabbalistic or esoteric Christianity in the face of the monotheistic distortions of the Catholics and the Protestants. This is why she refers to exoteric Judaism and exoteric Christianity, implying that there are esoteric varieties of each. Moving now to this notion of Eastern esotericism, this is precisely the concept that Marco Pasi highlighted as a theosophical forerunner of the present-day academic definitions of Western esotericism. We've seen that Blavatsky gave the Kabbalah Eastern, and specifically Indian origins, and as Wouter Hanegraaff and others have shown, this notion of various types of Eastern origins for the Kabbalah was common in the 19th century and was not at all limited to occultist circles. It has a background in Romanticism, which from the second half of the 18th century saw in India a more holistic, spiritual and fully realized culture that was possessed of a primitive and fundamental spiritual knowledge that had been lost to the West, and that was the source of all wisdom and civilization. And Isaac Lubelsky has highlighted the work of academic Orientalists like William Jones and Friedrich Max Müller as direct influences on the Theosophical Society in this regard. But today, I want to focus on Blavatsky's own understanding of the Eastern esoteric philosophy as being identical with the Advaita Vedanta and what this means for her understanding of Kabbalah and monotheism. The Advaita or non-dual Vedanta that Blavatsky encountered in late 19th century India was in fact Neo-Vedanta. Interestingly, the term was current at the time and Blavatsky rejected it, denying that her Advaita Vedanta was Neo-Vedanta, since she found this offensive. Advaita Vedanta was, according to Blavatsky, obviously not a new creation, but the most ancient of Aryan traditions. Blavatsky's protestations notwithstanding, the concept of Hinduism was an invention of the 19th century Orientalists, and Neo-Vedanta was a modern form of Hindu thought that arose in the context of colonialism and in contact with European esoteric thought, as demonstrated by Elizabeth de Michaelis in her History of Modern Yoga. Neo-Vedanta became so popular in the 19th century that it came to be almost synonymous with the notion of Hinduism, a fact that's reflected in Blavatsky's writings. Blavatsky's most important Neo-Vedantic contact was this guy, Talapagada Subaro, a Brahmin lawyer who assisted in editing Secret Doctrine. Rose thought had all the hallmarks of an essentializing neo-Hinduism that was bothered by contemporary science and Victorian cultural pessimism, framing the Oriental philosophy as a singular, homogeneous entity of absolute truth, and referring to the West's spiritual sickness brought on by the advancement of science. Subaro was influenced by this guy, Ram Mohan Roy, the famous father of the Hindu Renaissance. In 1828, Roy had founded a Hindu Unitarian syncretist movement known as the Brahmo Samaya, or Society of God, which included Neo-Vedantic elements. Roy was committed to the historical, critical reading of scripture that was fashionable in Germany at the time. He focused on the moral precepts of Jesus and denied the Trinity, condemning superstition and belief in miracles. He was critical of Hindu idolatry and superstition, which he believed resulted in the degradation of morality, but also criticized Christianity for its own idolatrous and polytheistic, that is, Trinitarian teachings. The notion of monotheism was one of Roy's central tenets, and he argued that the Upanishads and Vedanta were in fact monotheistic. He saw Hindu idolatry as a corruption of the original Indian monotheistic religion. Roy's assessment is an excellent illustration of how the term monotheism was developed in the 19th century in a polemical context. According to the Oxford English Dictionary, the term monotheism only appears in print for the third time in the early 19th century. Thereafter, the terms monotheism, polytheism, henotheism, and pantheism were developed by 19th century scholars as classificatory tools in the study of religions. They all presuppose each other and carried value judgments with them. Theories about the superiority of monotheism were developed in the context of colonial expansion, serving the assertion of the religious and cultural superiority of European Enlightenment values. And Roy's monotheistic Hindu Golden Age could be seen as a strategy designed to boost Hindu self-esteem in the face of this colonialism. Monotheism was generally considered the summit of religious advancement, as can be seen in the entry for theism in the article written for the 1889 9th edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica by Edinburgh Professor of Divinity Robert Flint. Although monotheism had sometimes been assumed to have been the primitive religion, as in the case of Ram Mohan Roy's Hindu Golden Age, Flint wrote that the vast majority of recent anthropologists hold that religion originates in some rude phase of polytheism, and that monotheism has everywhere been preceded by polytheism. Theories included various versions of the idea that the Israelite religion evolved towards monotheism through various stages, including animism, totemism, polytheism, and henotheism, and examples include the works of E.B. Tyler, Auguste Comte, and Julius Wellhausen. In his encyclopedia article, Flint stated that Israel was the first example of a monotheistic nation, but even Israel hadn't started out as monotheistic. He argued that, in the measure in which reason advances either on the path of scientific investigation or of philosophical speculation, polytheism must retreat and disappear in the measure in which it discovers unity, order, system, moral government, indications of spiritual character and design in the world. Monotheism must rise and spread. This equation of monotheism with reason, progress, and morality is immediately reminiscent of Roy. And Flint did in fact give Roy as an example of the transcendence of polytheism through piety, writing that Brahmoism is perhaps the most remarkable example of a Unitarian theism which exhibits all the characteristics of a positive faith and a churchly organization. Roy's project was continued in India by another organization that included Neo-Vedantic elements, the Arya Samaya, or Aryan Society, which was initially led by Swami Dayananda and had close ties with the Theosophists. Blavatsky described the Brahmo-Samaya as the Lutheran Protestants of Orthodox Brahmanism, and the Arya-Samaya as being similar to those learned mystics, the Gnostics, who understood the true esoteric meaning of Christianity. According to Blavatsky, the principal difference between the two societies was that the Brahmos believed in a personal God, whereas the Aryas believed in the everlasting, impersonal principle, Para-Brahman. This is like saying that the Arya-Samaya were like Kabbalists, whereas the Brahmos, despite having many good qualities, were monotheists. It was against this prevalent notion of the superiority of monotheism that Blavatsky postulated the impersonal, absolute Ein Sof, which she equated with the Neo-Vedantic notion of Para-Brahman popularized by the Arya-Samaya. In her article on the Arya-Samaya, Blavatsky referred to the crushing hand of ecclesiastical and monarchical despotism, and said that the Theosophical Society hoped to rescue so-called heathens from the influence of Christian missionaries, exoteric idolatry, and Brahmanism. Blavatsky's reading of Ein Sof therefore had some clear ideological ends. Her longer discussions of Ein Sof are part of her cosmogenesis in the first volume of The Secret Doctrine, which offered a new interpretation of the Book of Genesis. This was given in the context of the growth of German comparative history and biblical criticism, which had reframed the Bible as a historical text, as well as recent discoveries in geology that had challenged the notion of a six-day creation. Blavatsky responded to all of this with an esotericist and allegorical reading. She claimed that the initial 4 chapters of Genesis are but a fragment of a page in the world's cosmogony, which in their present corrupted form is nothing like is like a nursery tale. Blavatsky filled in the missing information, in which Ein Sof formed part of a pantheistic or perhaps monistic fourfold system of emanation with Neoplatonic parallels. She described Ein Sof as the absolute impersonal Para-Brahman, which emanated the next level, the impersonal unmanifested Logos, the architect of the universe. Then came the manifested Logos, and finally the world as we know it. Blavatsky was careful to emphasize that Ein Sof is not God and is not the creator. It emanates the levels below it, and it is they that are involved in the creation of the cosmos. In this monistic vision, spirit and matter ultimately come from Ein Sof and are two sides of the same substance which combine to create consciousness. Thus, through reference to Ein Sof, Blavatsky argued for the necessity of an intracosmic deity and the inseparability of spirit and matter. Blavatsky posited her cosmogony as an alternative to what she perceived as two extremes. I'd like to look a little more closely at what Blavatsky meant when she referred to materialism. At that time, materialism was a philosophical position associated, although not identical, with scientific naturalism. Early 19th century scientists such as John Herschel, Charles Lyell, and William Whewell had seen scientific inquiry as compatible with belief in a God who acted within creation. In the 1860s and the 1870s, which is exactly when Blavatsky was formulating her ideas, scientific naturalists such as biologist Thomas Henry Huxley, the physicist John Tyndall, argued that it was impossible to arrive at true knowledge of any reality that lay beyond the senses. Transcendental realities, the scientific naturalists insisted, were unknown and unknowable in any field. Materialism was defined differently by different writers, often referring to psychophysical parallelism and sometimes to materialistic metaphysics. Blavatsky referred to it in both senses and condemned it as the crass and illogical position that denies the existence of spirit in both man and the universe. It prevents scientists from believing in the divine, because unlike occultists and Kabbalists, they do not understand the true essence and nature of matter. Blavatsky's writings engage directly with the ideas of scientific naturalists like Huxley and Tyndall, with their various forms of various forms of materialism. These scientists also tended to favour Darwinism that Blavatsky rejected despite her evolutionism. And all of this took place against the background of a perceived battle between science and religion, as famously formulated in John William Draper's 1874 work, The History of the Conflict between Science and Religion, a polemical work that argued that throughout history, religion has endeavoured to suppress scientific truths. Despite the perceptions of writers like Draper and the Victorians themselves more generally, there was no battle between a monolithic science and a monolithic religion, but rather the negotiation of multiple definitions of both science and religion. For Blavatsky, it wasn't so much about a battle between science and religion as about the negotiation of the territory that lay between a credulous superstition and a deadening materialism. As we can see from the quoted extract, her kabbalistic reading of a unified spirit-matter cosmos emanating from Ein Sof, Para-Brahman, was crucial in this negotiation. So to sum up, I started out stating that I wanted to contextualize Blavatsky's Kabbalah. In basing myself on an extract from The Secret Doctrine, I sketched out some of the contemporary discussions Blavatsky's Kabbalah participated in and some of the relevant historiographical issues. Marco Patti showed that Blavatsky's Kabbalah participated in a demarcation of Eastern and Western esotericism, and I've added to this by discussing some of the Neo-Hindu and more specifically Neo-Vedantic background to Blavatsky's reading of the Kabbalah as Eastern esotericism. I've also shown that Blavatsky's rejection of monotheism and embrace of Para-Brahman was part of her engagement with the Arya Samaya. Blavatsky's equation of Ein Sof with the Neo-Vedantic Para-Brahman of the Arya Samaya was part of a polemic directed against both monotheism and materialism. The anti-monotheist polemic was not conceived so much as a denial of Christianity as of its redemption through Kabbalistic interpretation. In this reading, true original Christianity was a form of Kabbalah. Blavatsky's anti-monotheism was a denial of the dominant theory in the study of religions that proposed monotheism as the summit of religious advancement. This dominant theory had been mirrored in the earlier Vedic monotheism of Ramohan Roy and had a colonialist agenda that asserted the superiority of a supposedly more rational European culture. Blavatsky rejected the personal deity of the Brahmos and embraced the impersonal absolute of the Aryas, which she equated with Ein Sof. I framed Blavatsky's anti-materialist polemic in her wider discussions with the scientific naturalists, arguing that Blavatsky's Kabbalah formed part of her definition of the problem and its solution, the negotiation of the territory between superstition and materialism. If there is an underlying theme in all this, I would argue that it is Blavatsky's anti-authoritarianism levelled against contemporary scholars of religion, scientific naturalists, Christian clergy and missionaries, and Orthodox Brahmins. At the same time, she set herself up as an authority in the interpretation of Kabbalah, and the Theosophical Society, its journal The Theosophist, and Blavatsky's own works became the new institutional arrangements to guard the authenticity of this supposedly ancient tradition. This offers, I hope, some insights into how Kabbalah participated in the strategies that one particular late 19th century thinker developed in response to the Victorian crisis, of which for her, at the very least, a crisis of authority surely formed a part.